In this tutorial, you'll learn how to build a beautiful transparent nav bar with HTML and CSS.
All right, so this is what we want to create. So let's open up our code editor. I'm using Visual Studio Code and I have found a logo here. This is just an image, an SVG image. So we're going to start off with an HTML file. I'm going to call it index.html. And I'm going to close the sidebar with Control B. And then I can type HTML, press the second option, press tab to get this HTML boilerplate. So let's see, we're going to need a couple of things in this project. Let me change the title here to something like a transparent nav bar. So we're going to link to our own style sheet. So I can write link, press tab. It will give me the entire link element. It's going to be a style.css file. Let's actually create that file here as well. Style.css. All right. I'm going to hold Control B again to close the sidebar. Now we're also going to use a different font. So if you look at the font here, you can see it's a different font than the default one. It's actually called Inter. So you can go to fonts.google.com and then you can find all sorts of beautiful fonts here. So my go-to font is Inter. It looks very professional. It's very popular. It's actually quite similar to Roboto. So let's see, you can pick the font weights that you want. Let's pick light, regular, medium, semi-bold, bold. Then you can click on the icon and it will show you how to include that in your HTML. So you need to copy this and go to your HTML. I will paste it right here. I'm going to hold Shift-Alt-F to format everything. And the first two links are just for optimizations. And then the third link is the link that actually fetches the font. Okay, so let's try opening this up in the browser. I'm going to hold this HTML file and I'm going to put it on top of the browser there. I'm going to zoom a little bit just so you can see what I'm doing. You don't have to do that, but it's just for the tutorial. All right, so currently, of course, it's an empty page. And let's actually start with the HTML. So the image itself will just be a background image on the body element. So we don't have to add any HTML for that. And then for the nav bar, we have this logo. It's actually just that SVG image. Then we have these two or actually three items in the nav, right? This will actually be the nav. Well, it's going to be two links and then a button. So let's see how we can structure this in the HTML. So in the body here, I can say header, because there's actually a header tag in HTML, which is appropriate for this. And I can write .header to give it a class of header as well. And then press tab, it will give me the entire element, including whatever you write after the dot as a class name. So then a good trick here, because you can see the header itself should extend the entire width, right? So we're going to have a background color here with a lower opacity, but the header itself stretches the entire width. However, the content in there is restrained a little bit in terms of width, right? It's a bit centered here. Typically what you want to do is you want to create another element there that you can restrain in terms of width, right? So we're going to call that header underscore content. I'm using BEM notation here. Definitely check out my CSS course if you want to take your CSS to a professional level. It includes how to name your classes and things like that. You can find the link for that course in the description. So then in there we have a logo. And we have the actual links. So for the logo, well, typically you want to be able to click it, right? People want to be able to click the logo. So typically you have an anchor tag for that. We'll give it a class of logo. And in this case, it's not going anywhere. And then we have the actual image. We'll give that a class of logo underscore image. That's the logo.svg file here that I showed you at the beginning. I'll just give this an alt of logo. All right. And then we have the actual nav, right? So a nav tag is for the important sets of navigation, right? And it's typically structured as follows. So it's going to be quite nested, so bear with me. So typically it's a list. So we can call it nav list. And then in a list you have LIs, right? So it's going to be nav items. And then in the item you have the actual link, right? So quite nested here, but this is the proper markup. So let's say we have a link called solutions. I'm going to place my caret on this line. I'm going to hold shift and then up arrow key and then again. And then I'm going to hold shift alt down arrow key to duplicate these lines. Right, so we also have projects. And then we have contact here. Now this last item should actually not be a link, but a button. Right, so we'll give this a class of btn. So make sure you change it from nav link into btn. All right, so I'm going to save here and let's see what we have. So it's going to be one big mess. The logo is white, right? So we're not going to see that here. And yeah, it looks like a mess, but at least we can see we added something to the HTML. All right, so let's actually style this to make it look like it's supposed to look. So let's go to our CSS. Now I like to start off with a CSS reset because the browser adds some default styling to a lot of elements. For example, for these anchor tags, it makes the color blue and it adds this underline. For lists, it adds these bullet points, right? And there's lots of other things like it adds margin and padding. So we don't want a lot of that. So we want to start from a clean slate. So I'm going to say reset here. I like to add some comments in my style sheet just for, adding some structure. So we can select all elements with the universal selector. And then we can remove all margin. And then if I save and refresh, you can see it already looks a bit different. And I don't want to keep refreshing whenever I make a change. So I have an extension here called Live Server. I have installed this. And what you can do with that extension, I can right click here, open with Live Server, and it will open up this project in a, live server, meaning it will automatically refresh whenever I make a change in my HTML or CSS and also JavaScript. So now, for example, when I say padding 0, if I save here, it automatically refreshes the page. Right, now typically people also set the box sizing property to border box. This is actually a very advanced property. Most developers don't understand this. I have a separate video on this if you want to learn what that's about. So we also want to reset the UL. We don't want to have the bullet points. We don't see the bullet points right now because it's sitting against the edge of the viewport, but they're still there. And then for the anchor tags, we want to remove the text decoration, that's the underline, and then the color should simply be inherited, right? So it should simply inherit the dominant color on the page. So then let's continue with some base styles. Right, so here we're going to add the background color perhaps, or the font family, the background image. Right, so for the font, we can set font family. The one that we are linking to in our HTML is called Inter, but we still have to set that here with font family, right? Now maybe the font family is not available. Maybe this server is not working. So then here you can provide a backup. So we can also just say sans serif, pick any sans serif font that is available on the user's computer if Inter is not available, right? That's what it means. All right, so if I save here, you can already see that the text looks a bit different. All right, so now let's actually add the background image. So I found an image on unsplash.com. You can find all sorts of beautiful images here. So I just found an image and I have the URL here, so I'm just going to copy that from my note. Right, so I'm going to close here, but you can find your own image. Right, so then you can say background image. Right, so I don't have to write out the complete property name every time. I can also just write background I. It will suggest the image for me. So then I can just press tab, and then it's going to be a URL. And then in the URL, I'm going to paste the actual link. Right, so when I do that, this is going to be the image, what it looks like right now, but it should actually be a little different because it's a very large image. So it's not going to be the perfect size. So typically with a background image, at least with a full screen background image, you want to do some other things as well. So we're going to say the following. So typically we don't want to have any repetition, right? So typically you want to prevent any repetition in case that happens. We want to make sure it actually is covered so that we can actually see the image. Right, so now we can see it in full, but there's no repetition, right? If you leave this off, it will repeat itself, right? So we don't want any repetition, but we still want this to sort of go all the way to the bottom. We want to remove that white space, so we can say background attachment should be fixed. Right, so then it's actually covering the entire viewport. And then we'll also say background position center. So it should be centered both horizontally and vertically. And that's relevant because when we make it smaller or bigger, you can see it stays centered, right? So it's a responsive full screen background image now. All right, so then let's continue with the actual navbar here. So those are base styles, and then we have the actual, normal styles, right? Other styles, whatever you want to call it. So let's start off with the header. Let's just give it the background color. Right, so that's going to be, let's see, the following. So it needs to be sort of a see-through, transparent navbar color. So what you can do is you can just use RGBA to deal with the opacity. So you can say RGBA 19, 22, 26, and then another value here for the opacity. Right, so we can make it, for example, 60% opacity. So you can see it's a bit transparent now, and you can reduce this to 0.2 to make it more transparent, right? You can even make it 0. And maybe what you want, for example, is when you start scrolling, it becomes, a more solid color, right? But initially, perhaps it should be transparent, right? We're just going to leave it like this. I'll just make it 60%. I think that looks best in this project here. All right, so then we're going to need to do some layout here. Now, when you work with layouts, you want to go, your go-to solution should pretty much be Flexbox, right? You want to use Flexbox in the vast majority of layout situations. So it's really important that you have mastered Flexbox, but also other concepts in CSS like CSS grid, animations, and transitions. And there's so much more like this background stuff. There's like tons of little things that you need to know in CSS. So if you want to work as a web developer, or maybe you're already working in web development, definitely make sure your CSS, you know, is at a pretty advanced or professional level. So definitely check out my professional CSS course if you haven't mastered Flexbox and CSS grid and all those animations and transitions, all those other concepts yet. The link is in the description. So here we can use display flex, and it will put the logo and the nav. And that's how we structured it here. There is a logo and a nav, right? And their parent element is this header content. So with Flexbox, it's always about a parent element and then the flex items, which are the child elements. So header content now is the flex container, and display flex will automatically position them next to each other horizontally, but they also should be vertically in the center. So we can use align items for that. And then there should be space between them, right? So for horizontal alignment here, we can use justify content. We can say space between. Right? So then there's as much space between them as possible. You could also say center, right? Or end. Right, so justify content is for horizontal alignment here. Now we just want space between. All right. Now with responsiveness, you can see right now it's always sitting against the edge of the viewport, right? And in our example here, you can see it's not sitting against the edge. The width is a bit restrained. Here it's always sitting against the edge, right? So we don't want that. There should be a maximum width for the content here. That's why we did it with this header content element. So what you can do is you can set a maximum width of 1200 pixels. Now it's 1200 pixels, but then it should also be centered. So the trick here is to use margin auto. So if you use max width, you can use margin auto. So you can say 0 on top and bottom, auto on left and right side. And this has nothing to do with Flexbox. This is a separate trick. If you do that, it will be centered. We'll work on the nav links in a second, but now it's the correct size. So we also want to set a height on this header content. We're gonna make this 60 pixels. And then we can work on, well, actually the logo here doesn't look right. And the logo should sit a bit lower. So this logo image, let's see, we have logo and we have logo image. Because it's an inline level element, inline level elements, they have some white space below them. So we're going to convert that from inline to simply a block level element with display block, right? So now it's a little bit, it's positioned vertically a little bit better. Now it's also not completely the same as in the example. So here it's a little bit more restrained even. And that's because this header content also has some padding on the side. So then if the viewport is smaller, for example, it will not sit against the edge. You can see it becomes smaller, but it will never sit against the edge because there is padding here. So we also want to add some padding of 0 on top and bottom and 30 pixels on the right and left side. So if we do that, it's going to be the same as in the example, right? So this is already quite nice in terms of responsiveness. Without any media queries, this is already something you can do. All right, now in the example, the logo is a bit smaller. So this image here, we can just set a height or width to something and it will automatically resize. Okay, so it's a bit smaller. I think that looks a little bit better. Okay, so now let's work on the actual nav part here. So in the nav, we have this list, we have items, and we have links. Right, so let's just select all of that just to get it over with. So we have .nav, we have nav list, right? Using BEM notation, that's why you're going to see a lot of those weird underscores. But that's a very clean and structured way of naming your classes. Right? It's also part of my CSS course. So we have nav, nav list, item, and link. So these links, let's give them a color of white, but with a little bit of opacity. So let's make it white, so 255, but then with, let's say, 0.75 opacity, so we can actually see them. Okay, now the other one is a button, right? So we will work on that in a second. All right, now they're sitting vertically, right? They should sit horizontally, right? So you can use, it's a layout problem, so you want to use Flexbox probably. So you have to identify the parent element, right? So we have these nav items, their parent element is this nav list. So you can just say display flex, and this will become the flex container, and the default layout is that they're gonna sit like this. Now, if we also want space between them, we can do it with Flexbox very easily as well. Column gap, 40 pixels. All right, now the font size of these nav links, let's make that a little bit smaller, 15 pixels. All right, and let's also add a hover effect for these nav links. So when we hover them, maybe they should become completely white. So a nav link in the hover state, we can copy this color declaration, and instead of 75% opacity, it should become 100% opacity on hover. So now they become completely white. Now this is instant, this is not very smooth, right? So we can make it a transition. So you can go to the normal rule set, not in the hover state, just the normal rule set. And you can specify transition here. And you can say here, if the color property that gets changed, that should happen in, let's say, 0.4 seconds. That's what you specify here. So now if you hover it, it's nice and smooth, right? Now in the real world, we could be changing other things as well, like the font size, you know, we could add multiple things in here. So typically it's easier to just say all. So any property that gets changed for this nav link, it should happen in 0.4 seconds. So in practice, this is what you're going to see more often. And maybe you also want this when you click on it, right? So when you click on a nav link, it becomes the focused element on the page. There can only be one element on the page that is focused. And maybe you also want to keep that white color when it's focused, right? So when you click on it, so you can say not only for the hover state, but also nav link in the focus state, right? So now when you click on it, it keeps that styling, right? So when you click on the other one gets it. And if I click out of there, it gets removed, right? So that's just a side note. Let's work on the button here. So we also have .btn. That one should actually get completely white color, and it should get that blue background color. So we'll say background color 0071E3, and we'll add some padding, 7 pixels on top and bottom, 18 pixels on right and left side. It should be a pill shape, so that to do that, you can just make it a very large border radius. And let's see what else we want to do. It should be uppercase. So I can write text T. It will already suggest the property for me. I don't have to write it out. And then I only have to write U. It will already suggest uppercase. I can just press tab here. Okay, the font size, I only have to write font S. Press tab. Can be 12 pixels. All right, now it looks a bit thin. So we're going to make the font weight 500. And that's about it. Now we can also add a hover effect for the button, right? So we can say button in the hover state. Maybe the background color should become a little bit lighter, for example. So typically what you can do in the real world is I would just copy the normal color, right? And then you can just hover this and you can just pick a slightly lighter color, right? That's the easiest way. That's what I do in practice. Now, if you want to get the exact same color as me, that's going to be RGB 28, 128. 228, it's going to be slightly lighter blue. So then when you hover it, it becomes a bit lighter, right? This also should be a transition, right? So in the normal rule set, not in the hover state, in the normal rule set, you can specify a transition here. So, right, so this is one of those concepts in CSS, and this is still quite easy transition, but there's also animations with keyframes, for example, right? So there's a lot to CSS. Don't underestimate it, especially Flexbox, especially once you get into more complicated layouts. But there's all sorts of little things and tricks that you need to know. So definitely check out my CSS course. So here we can just say the change should happen. Well, we could say 0.4 seconds, right? And then it's the same as the other ones. All right, let's work on responsiveness a little bit more. So I'm going to right click here, click on inspect. And here we can play around with the width of the viewport, as this is called. This is called the viewport. This is the visible area of the web page, right? So if I go out of here, this is the viewport. It does not include the address bar or anything that has to do with the browser. That is not included. It's only what we see on the website here, right? So that's what you're dealing with when you're dealing with responsiveness. So we can play around with the width of the viewport here. And here you can see the actual width, right? So right now it's about 933 pixels wide. So when you're dealing with responsiveness, what you're going to do, we're doing it desktop first. So what we're going to do is we're going to make it smaller and smaller. And at some point, you know, we can already see there's going to be a problem here. So that's going to be a so-called breakpoint, right? So around here, we should solve that. That's going to be the breakpoint. So let's say 650. We want to change the layout, because then from going smaller and smaller, it's going to cause issues, right? So what you can do is at the bottom here, you can have media queries, right? And it's like this. So you say add media on small devices, so like phones and small tablets. So when the width is at most, right, let's say 650 pixels, right? So that's what we just decided on. So when the width is at most, the maximum width is 650 pixels, then we want to have a slightly different layout, right? Because on very small devices, we're going to get these issues. So at 650 and smaller, we should have a different layout. So let's think about this. Let's look at the example. So in the example, we get a more vertical flow, right? So at 650, we go from this to this. So how can we do that? So this is another layout problem, actually. So this is another reason for learning Flexbox and for checking out my professional CSS course, because in there you will walk away with, mastery of Flexbox and also CSS grid and all these other concepts. But here we can use Flexbox. So we want to get that vertical flow. So we can just select that header content, right? Because this is the parent element of the nav and the logo. And the default layout is horizontal, but we can also make it vertical. So we can change the flex direction to column. Right, so now we get this as the layout. Now, of course, there should be a little bit more space on the top and bottom. So we're going to say padding, 25 pixels on top and bottom, 0 on left and right side. And now there should be some space between the logo and the nav as well. So we can say row gap should be 18 pixels. And then we also want to make sure that the column list actually... Let's take a look. There's something going on here with the background color not covering the entire height here. And that's because we set the height here of the header content to 60 pixels, but it should be allowed to become bigger. So we can also just say the minimum height should be 60 pixels. Right, so make sure you change this into min height, because then it will be at least 60 pixels. So on wider devices, it's just going to be 60. But here, when we change the layout and it actually should become taller, it's allowed to become bigger, right? Let's see, let's compare with the example. So in the example, you can see that these items are a bit closer to each other. So we're going to reduce that column gap, right? So we have nav list. We set a column gap of 40 pixels. We can change it to 20 pixels. So it will be a bit closer to each other, right? So this is a quick way of making it responsive, because now when we make the viewport even smaller and we're getting into mobile territory, it still looks great, right? So the smallest size that you typically want to support is about 320 pixels. Depends a bit on your use case, on your users. There are devices out there like the foldable phones and things like that. But if you look on iPhone, for example, it looks great. When you flip it around horizontal and you get landscape mode, it looks great, right? Because then the viewport becomes wider again, right? And the media queries automatically adapt, right? So you can play around with the various devices here that Chrome has in their tool here. This looks great. And this is, just a quick example of how you can make a project responsive. In the real world, it's going to be more complicated. So I highly recommend you check out my project in the professional CSS course, because those are real world projects that we will build from scratch. And you can really see how it's done in the real world. You can see how everything fits together and really get a deep control over your CSS. And also, if you were interested in web development, you should also learn JavaScript. I have a separate course on that. We also have some beautiful projects in there. By the way, if this was helpful, I'd really appreciate it if you could like and subscribe. Also, check out my courses on CSS and JavaScript if you want to take those skills to an advanced level. Because in there, we will build some beautiful real-world projects from scratch, so you can see how everything fits together and really master CSS or JavaScript. And I will also release other courses soon, like React and Node.js. So if you want to be notified, then make sure you are subscribed to the email newsletter. You can find the link in the description. Thanks for watching, and I hope to see you soon.